Should Massachusetts cities and towns have the right to refuse a hazardous waste treatment facility? Tonight on The Advocates.
Good evening. I'm Dave Finnegan, and welcome to The Advocates. Tonight, our subject is hazardous chemical waste and the problems we face in either disposing or treating these substances. Under existing state laws, cities and towns must cooperate with companies who wish to build hazardous waste treatment facilities, even if the community feels the facility is inappropriate. Our question tonight is, should cities and towns in Massachusetts have the right to refuse hazardous waste treatment facilities? Advocate Abby Nelson says yes.
According to current law, when a company selects a site, if the state approves, the city or the community must negotiate with that company, and if the company won't accede to the request of the community, there is binding arbitration. Now, what's wrong with that process? First, the company gets to select the site. The town and the townspeople have nothing to say. Second, although state approval is required, until 3 weeks ago, there were no state regulations in effect. And yet the state was routinely granting requests for sites. In fact, all requests for all sites, for all companies, have been granted so far in Massachusetts. Third, even though there are now regulations, they got lots of loopholes, including, by the way, grandfathering in all the prior approvals. One site, incidentally, in Haverhill, is located right near a drinking supply, which is a dangerous place to locate a hazardous waste facility. And lastly, the question of home rule. People want to control their own destiny. They want to be able to make decisions about whether or not to locate a site facility within the confines of their town. They're concerned about security and safety. They've been told, trust the state and trust the companies, but the track record for both is none too good. They want to be able to control the decision process. They want to be able to accept a hazardous waste facility site, but they also want to be able to refuse. To help me make the case tonight, I have two distinguished witnesses. Mr. Walter Malicka, who is a hydrogeologist and a water resource protection expert, and Dr. Ken Geiser, professor of environmental policy at Tufts University.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. And Advocate Margaret Marshall says no.
300,000 tons of hazardous waste are generated each year in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And where does the waste come from? Small shops, big corporations, mechanics, garages, individuals like you and me. But the problem isn't who generates the waste, it's what happens to it. In Massachusetts, there simply are not adequate treatment facilities to deal with the hazardous waste. And the result is that most of it is illegally dumped. Rivers, streams, lakes, some of it onto open land. So far, we've identified 31 towns with contaminated water supplies. And if that's not a crisis, I don't know what a crisis in Massachusetts is. There's only one way that you can stop this midnight dumping, and that's by building safe, modern treatment facilities right here in Massachusetts. If we allow every town to say no, to veto every project, we simply guarantee that illegal waste dumping will occur, and with it, incalculable health hazards. The Massachusetts siting law gives extensive control to cities and towns to decide where and when a treatment facility will be built. And as citizens or homeowners, we have every right to insist upon rigorous safety standards to ensure our security for the future and at present. But we can't put our heads in the sand and ignore the problem and hope it will go away. With me tonight to argue against a very short-term solution to this problem and to argue in favor of a rational, long-term solution is Dr. Anthony Cortese. Dr. Cortese is Commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Quality Engineering and a recognized expert in environmental health. John Mclennan is former Commissioner for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of New England, and a consultant in hazardous waste facilities.
Many products produce toxic chemical waste at some stage of their manufacture. Cars, clothing, leather. Even electronic circuit boards manufactured for the Massachusetts computer industry produce some form of hazardous waste. The technology exists to neutralize or to recycle many of these toxic chemicals. Some solvents can be cleaned and reused. Some chemicals can be rendered harmless by the addition of other chemicals, and some toxic waste can be incinerated. A few will require long-term burial in a secure landfill. But how safe are the treatment facilities themselves? How risky is it to live near a facility? Can we do without them? And what happens if we do not build any facilities in Massachusetts? And how good is the process being used in the Commonwealth for picking sites? These are among the questions we hope to deal with this evening. The widespread public awareness that hazardous waste might cause human health problems goes back to the story of Love Canal, which broke in 1978. Serious health problems were attributed to the dumping of thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals in an old canal, which later became the site of a housing development. As more and more dump sites were uncovered in other parts of the country, including Massachusetts, the public has become wary, not only of the many illegal chemical dumps, but also of the proposed alternatives, licensed treatment facilities. Massachusetts has two programs for controlling hazardous waste. One program keeps track of the substances from where they are generated to where they are treated or stored. The other is a program to site new modern treatment facilities. The Massachusetts Siting Law designates a 21-member Hazardous Waste Site Safety Council to oversee the siting of proposed facilities, and the State Department of Environmental Quality Engineering to regulate them. But under Massachusetts law, a firm may locate, purchase, and designate a site over the objections of local communities, who must either prove the proposal unworthy or cooperate with the developer in a negotiating process. Should communities be able to refuse such facilities? Advocate Nelson says yes, they should. Mr. Nelson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I call Mr. Walter Mclennan.
Good evening and welcome to the Advocates.
Thank you.
Mr. Mclennan is a hydrogeologist, a water resource protection expert, and a consultant with IEP Corporation. Now, Mr. Mclennan, you are indeed a groundwater expert. Can anyone guarantee to the public that a hazardous waste facility is going to be absolutely safe?
No, I don't believe anybody can guarantee that.
Well, if it can't be guaranteed, then how is a town to make a decision when there is a proposal for a hazardous waste site within the confines of its borders?
Very simply by guaranteeing that the location is a proper location. The location really controls any kind of environmental considerations, because if the location is very carefully chosen by state-of-the-art methods in the appropriate locations, you can minimize any kind of environmental degradation, and you can minimize any kind of impacts, for example, to water supplies.
Well, now, if the site is very important, does it strike you as somewhat unfair that the current siting law in Massachusetts says that the company gets to choose the site, and the town and the townspeople have no say in it?
Yes, I believe it's totally unfair and technically unreasonable.
Well, now, besides problems with the site, what other things can go wrong with a waste treatment facility?
Well, if we look at the history of what's preceded facilities that have been built, there are a number of things that have occurred that have created problems in the past. For example, as financial conditions change in the company, in many cases a company is forced to cut back in certain areas. One of the easiest areas to cut back on is environmental protection and monitoring. Secondly, there are certain unforeseen problems that can occur that were certainly not anticipated during the design or permit seeking phases. For example, there can be certain site conditions which were never expected, which give rise to certain failures. There can be certain catastrophic events such as explosions or floods that no one anticipated.
Well, let's bring it home to Massachusetts. Now, the Siting Council has approved 2 sites in Massachusetts, one in Haverhill, one in Warren. What about those sites? Do you think the public is secure in terms of the safeguards?
Well, if we consider the Haverhill facility, there are a number of major shortcomings that have been brought out. The site is within 100 feet of the Merrimack River. The site is within an area which is subject to flooding. During the last major flood which occurred, the area was totally inundated by water. The Merrimack River is going to be used as a surface water supply in the very near future by the city of Haverhill. And the downstream town of Groveland, Massachusetts, has municipal wells within 50 feet of the river. And as it turns out, this is their only viable supply which still remains.
Their only viable supply, and it's going to be located within a few hundred feet of this site. What about the track record of the company that wants to build the waste facility site there in Haverhill next to the Merrimack River?
Well, it's been brought out by a number of sources that they have a lot of financial problems. It's been brought out that they're involved with a whole series of complaints and litigations with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. There's a major complaint and court case pending right now involving the contamination of 2 municipal wells in a town in Connecticut. Also, last October, the facility in Linden, New Jersey blew up.
It exploded.
Yes, sir.
Is the design for the one in Haverhill the same design as the one that is now defunct in New Jersey?
Both plants are distillation process plants.
So they may be designing the same thing in Haverhill.
Potentially the same kind of problems could be there.
Well, now, given these kinds of facts, does it appall you that the Siting Council in Massachusetts has granted approval for this company and this site in Haverhill?
I think it was a very poor choice, considering especially that it's the first time around.
Let's extrapolate a little bit. Can we say that the public should rest assured and trust the companies and trust the state that the safeguards and security will be protected by the procedures in effect?
Not if we consider the track record of the state agencies on this first case.
Let me shift for a moment. We heard mentioned early on by the other side about illegal dump sites and the prospect of fields full of canisters oozing chemicals. Do you think that if we have the state law as it is now in the Siting Council and we ram a site down people's throats, that illegal dumping will be a thing of the past in Massachusetts?
I think you have to realize that a lot of the illegal dumping that has occurred in the past has occurred by certain groups that are economically on the verge of going out of business. Also, a lot of these people are probably unreputable. There's no reason why these same companies should go through any kind of added expense when they can, for free, dump their wastes anywhere that they want.
It'll always be cheaper to throw it in the field.
Exactly. And if you look at the example of New Jersey, where there are stringent regulations on illegal dumping in place, and where there are approved where there are in place chemical waste dumps, New Jersey still has a great many problems with illegal dumping.
Thank you.
Yeah, but we're just about out of time. Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Now we'll go to Ms. Marshall for some questions to Mr. Malica.
Mr. Malica, you're not opposed to treatment facilities, are you?
No, not
They
at
are
all.
safe treatment facilities, aren't they? You just want them in some other state, not our state, any other state, right? Just not here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, isn't that correct?
No, I don't believe that's
Oh,
correct.
you do want them in Massachusetts. So, in fact, what you would do, let me see, you would go straight to the location. That's correct, isn't it?
I think that should be the first consideration.
Absolutely. So, in fact, if the state did a statewide survey and came up with the best state, the best location, you'd say, just you tell that local community to take that location and have a facility built there. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's a lot more complex than that.
I think it's a lot more complex than that, too, and I think it's a lot more complex than a developer saying, just take that site. In fact, there was a study done in 1978 that tried to identify the best sites for certain kinds of very comparatively safe hazardous waste. Wasn't that done?
I believe that's correct.
And in fact, what happened was, I believe it was the DEQE identified 3 potential sites as possible sites. Is that correct?
I believe that's
And do you know
correct.
what happened in that case?
I believe it...
Well, I'll tell you what happened. The legislature put through 1, 2, 3 bills put through by the representatives of those towns that said never is there to be a hazardous waste disposal site in any one of those 3 towns. That's what happens when the state tries to identify a site. Isn't that correct?
I don't think that would be correct in all cases.
Probably not, but at least we don't have any... we do have a record where the state has attempted to do that. It doesn't work.
That is correct.
Now, in connection with the Haverhill site, it's not entirely accurate to say that this site has been approved. It hasn't been approved, has it?
It has been tentatively approved under the feasible and deserving criteria of the law.
I think what's happened is that the process has been set into motion, and in fact now the local community does have the right, for example, to deny site assignment. Is that correct?
I don't believe it's at that stage.
It hasn't reached that stage, right?
I don't believe it has.
And what is a site assignment?
Well, in the initial stages, a site is determined to be feasible and deserving and worthy of future consideration
By who?
by the Site Safety Council.
But we're now back in Haverhill, and if that plant is to go forward, doesn't it have to get the approval of the local Board of Health?
Ultimately, it will have to get that approval, or it will have to go to court.
Exactly.
And there'll be a court
So
battle.
in fact, if the local Board of Health says, no, we don't believe that this is a safe plant, what happens?
It can go to litigation, and it's up to a judge to determine whether the Board of Health was
So in
ruling
fact,
correctly.
the state can't overrule the local Board of Health, can it? The developer can go to court and try to get a court to overrule it, but the state DEQE can't come in and overrule the local board, can it?
But there can be an awful lot of very valuable time and money that's spent by by both the state and by the developer and by the town in reaching
Oh, absolutely. An awful lot of time and
site.
money. The problem when you have a democratic process is it takes time and money. If you want local citizens to have an input, that takes time and money. You could do it the other way. Just say the state will say, put it here, no time and money. But in fact, that's not the way it proceeds. There's an awful lot of time and money from local communities. There are a few other things that the local community can do too, aren't there? Don't they have some say about the environmental impact report that has to be prepared?
Certainly their comments are solicited.
Of course. And has that environmental impact report has it been prepared?
Yes, it has been prepared.
And have comments been submitted?
Yes, they have.
And are they taken into account?
They have been up till now.
But the process is simply continuing. It's not as if it has been approved and there's no opposition.
That is correct. That's where it is in the legal process right now.
So in fact, what we really have in Massachusetts is not just the state telling the local community, but soliciting comments from the local community. I think I'm correct in that.
They do solicit the comments, yes.
Now, in connection with, let me take a look at some of the other factors here. If you have, let's say, an out-of-state corporation that you suggest, the corporation that's behind the project in Haverhill may not have financial security, isn't it written into the law in Massachusetts, Chapter 21C, that in fact the corporation has to have adequate insurance or put up a bond to insure against any potential failures?
That is written in the law, yes.
So in fact, you can look behind the corporation to see that it has adequate backing.
Yeah, I guess the question then is how hard do you look and what do you look for?
Well, I guess you look to see whether or not there's adequate insurance. Wouldn't that be a fair way to go?
That would be a good way to go, yes.
And in fact, that's written into the law.
Yes.
Doesn't the law also require that the corporation have specific contingent plans in case there's any kind of failure?
Yes, those are required.
And would those be in place in this particular case?
They would be required to be in place, but the question is, are they enough?
But they at least are there.
The law does require that there be contingency plans.
So on the one hand, you have community input. On the other hand, you have very strict state regulations.
We
Is that
just
the
have
case?
about 10 seconds for you to answer that, Mr. Mclennan.
Those are in place. The question is whether they're adequate and whether if a site is in a wrong place, whether they would be enough to protect the town in the case of a catastrophe.
But there's in fact a lengthy process which hasn't even been completed in Haverhill yet for the
Forgive
town
me
to
for
make that
interrupting,
adequately
but I
known.
think we're out of time at this point. Thank you, Mr. Mclennan, very much. Mr. Nelson will have a moment now for some more brief questions.
Yes, isn't it true, Mr. Mclennan, that if the town and the company can come to an impasse after a few days, about 60 days, then they can go to binding arbitration, isn't
That
it?
is correct.
And it can be rammed down the throats of the community.
That's correct.
Now, the Board of Health that was mentioned in the direct examination, they are restricted as to how much input they can have, aren't they?
Yes, they only come in at the very end of the process.
And they can't apply standards any more stringent than they would apply to any other facility, even though, if they had their way, they might want to apply higher standards.
That is correct.
And if the financial situation of the company turns out to be, for whatever reason, with the best of intention, misrepresented or in error, when the insurance doesn't cover, what happens? The company goes bankrupt, right?
That's correct, and it's, I guess, up to the state or the federal government to take care of it.
I wonder what happened to those people who were in the area when this company's other plant exploded in New Jersey. I wonder if it would help them to tell them that, well, we had all sorts of insurance safeguards in place. The financial regulations were met.
That's correct.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Mr. Mclennan, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it. And now for the case against. Ms. Marshall, the floor is yours.
I call as my first witness Dr. Anthony Cortese.
Dr. Cortese, welcome to the Advocates.
Thank you.
Dr. Cortese is Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Quality Engineering, commonly known as the DEQE, which I think is an easy way to address it. Dr. Cortese, before we get into the specifics of safety regulation, which we'll deal with at some length later, I'd like to just backtrack a little and ask you, what's at issue here is whether cities and towns have the right to veto, and that's a long-established tradition in Massachusetts. There would have to be some compelling need to override that tradition. What's the need here?
We really need safe hazardous waste disposal facilities.
Why?
We need them because if you wear a watch, you drive a car, you clean your clothes, you use medicines, then you're using products which produce hazardous waste. It would be nice if we could eliminate all hazardous waste. But when you look at the waste oil issue, which is 40% of the hazardous waste stream, it is impossible to think of a society that could exist without automobiles, planes, cars, and trucks, or any kinds of machines, all of which require lubricating oil.
But couldn't we do one of two things? Couldn't we ship it out of state, for example, the hazardous waste that's generated?
Right now, only 10% of the hazardous waste that is generated in Massachusetts can be adequately treated in Massachusetts. Most of it is being shipped out of state or is illegally dumped.
And how do we know whether or not it's being shipped or is illegally dumped?
Well, we have mechanisms to track that, but we know there's a significant amount of illegal dumping in Massachusetts. There are 97 confirmed hazardous waste sites in Massachusetts.
And if the regulations were more strictly enforced, couldn't we just ship it all out? I mean, do we have to have these treatment facilities here?
Well, regulation enforcement is just one part of the issue. We have a four-part strategy in dealing with hazardous waste, and building facilities is only one part. You have to have tough regulations, you have to enforce those tough regulations, and you have to clean up the past improper disposal practices as well.
But you've heard what Mr. Nelson, Mr. Malika is suggesting, that the regulations are kind of mediocre, low level, nobody pays any attention, firms will go bust, they won't have enough money, the DEQE won't step in and enforce it. I mean, is there going to be any other regulations in place?
There are plenty of regulations in place. What is not in place is just the final detailed regulations that might be necessary to look at just the most specific facilities and the most specific places. But the fact is we have plenty of regulations and we are enforcing them. Since 1980, when we got the new regulations, we have revoked 34 licenses of the 153 firms that handle hazardous waste in Massachusetts, and we've turned down 40 new applications. In addition to that, we've gotten 12 criminal convictions for illegal disposal of hazardous waste, and 9 people have actually gone to jail. On top of that, we've cleaned up 47 hazardous waste sites in the Commonwealth, most of those under court order or order from the department.
And if the regulations aren't sufficient and you're beginning to turn to treatment facilities, is there any kind of assurance that these facilities are safe? I mean, can they be absolutely safe, as Mr. Malika seems to be indicating?
You can make hazardous waste disposal facilities as safe as many of the hundreds of kinds of manufacturing establishments in Massachusetts that use hazardous materials and generate hazardous waste. But you cannot make anything absolutely safe. The only way you can do that is not to have them at all. And if we don't have safe hazardous waste facilities, we're going to have continued illegal dumping and continued potential health effects.
Well, if you're trying to find the middle ground someplace and you have treatment facilities and they can't be absolutely safe, I mean, isn't it reasonable for the community of Haverhill to say, look, you're in Boston, you have some regulations, and there's an out-of-state developer. How do we, the local community, keep any kind of control? How do we ensure our safety? I don't think you guys in Boston know what you're doing. It's my Mclennan River. You're 150 feet from my Mclennan River. How do I take care of that problem?
Well, first of all, nobody can build a facility in Massachusetts unless and until the local community gives an assignment and assigns the facility as appropriate and safe. Secondly, nobody can build a facility unless they get a DEQE license, and that license cannot be issued unless and until a full environmental impact report has been completed that looks at all the possible alternatives and all the impacts of the potential facility and determines that, in fact, that the state can go forward and make a decision, and the community as well. On top of that, the community can negotiate as part of the siting agreement. They can negotiate for compensation to be able to do their own independent monitoring to make sure that a facility is safe, and also to evaluate the facility during the process.
But haven't you already given your approval, as Mr. Malika seems to say it, of the Haverhill site? Hasn't that approval been given?
Absolutely
just about
not.
15 seconds for this answer, Doctor.
The Site Safety Council has not given any approval. They've just allowed it to go in the process, and it is not clear that we at DEQE will give a final license to that facility if it doesn't meet our tough standards.
And can you withdraw the license right at the last minute?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Now, Mr. Nelson has some questions for Dr. Cortese.
Dr. Cortese, let's differentiate between the standards of enforcement and the standards for citing. They are two different organizations within the Commonwealth. Is that correct?
Yes and no. With respect to the Department of Environmental Quality Engineering has to issue the final decision with respect to a facility in terms of location and everything else. The Site Safety Council only manages the process of siting in the Commonwealth. It does not make decisions on the adequacy of a particular site.
But it is the Site Safety Council, however, that has allowed, for example, the Haverhill site to go on to the next stage.
To get into the process.
So we are now in a process where the company and the community are going to go through extended negotiations where there will be a lot of money spent, and it may take a couple of years. And I guess the first question is, do you think it's fair that that site should warrant all this attention when there is serious question as to whether it's a viable site in the first place?
Well, there is going to be great debate about that site, and as I said, it's not clear that in fact it will finally get approval. There is a long process that we have to go through. There will be lots of public input into the final decision that DEQE makes. We have to go through the environmental impact report, which hasn't been completed in its final stage. And on top of that, it is clear that the community can say no if the site is inappropriate.
Yes, but you see, what you're asking the community to do is, in effect, trust the process. You're saying down the road a piece, your department will get to it, and you're going to have some tough standards. But so far, the track record of what's going on would not engender trust. Now, you say you represent...
I don't really agree that because the fact of the matter is the legislature understood that there would be opposition to these facilities when they created the law in the first place.
Dr. Cortese, they didn't even have regulations in place, and they gave the approval.
But they used criteria, and those criteria were well known by everybody.
They were.
You don't have to have regulations absolutely in place to be able to carry out the intentions
Well,
of
they
the
apparently
law.
thought they should because they got some 3 weeks ago. Let me go on, if I might. Let me go on. You represent your department on the Siting Council. Did you speak out against this proposed site in Haverhill when it came through?
I spoke as a member of the Site Safety Council. I cannot prejudge what decisions we will actually make in the long run.
But did you speak out when it was before the Site Safety Council?
Did I speak out?
Yes.
I must have spoken out about it.
Well, we'd be interested to know what you must have said.
Well, I was concerned about the site from the standpoint that it was near the Merrimack River, and it is potentially in the floodplain. But those kinds of decisions are not necessary at this point in time to say yes or no to a particular facility.
But I get the feeling that you, if you were speaking as a citizen of Haverhill, you would have had these same concerns. And isn't it true that the Siting Council, with these unidentified regulations, the criteria that everybody knows about, has okayed every proposal that has come forward so far?
Not so. In fact, we actively turned down 2 sites in New Bedford because the sites would have been located in wetlands for the Liquicon facility.
I don't know. You've approved 3 companies and 6 sites, 1 in Haverhill, 2 Warren. 3 sites were approved down in New
None
Bedford.
have been approved. They've just been allowed to go in the process.
The Siting Council has given its initial approval.
And remember, nobody can actually build a facility unless and until they have an assignment from the Board of Health and unless and until they have a license from the department.
Somewhere down the line, you're going to get them. But until that time, the community feels a little uncomfortable. Let me, if I might, go to the enforcement end of it, which I think you have stressed. Now, during the past 3 years, Massachusetts has counted on about half of its $16 million from the federal government. As you know, federal funds are sometimes in danger of being cut back. And if I may quote you, you said, "We are being put in the position of having to be very creative in deciding not just how, but whether the programs now in force are going to continue." You said this last month.
That's correct.
Would you say that this might make the community a little jittery if down the road they may be concerned that some of the tough enforcement programs may disappear?
Possible, but let me just say this. There is no higher priority than dealing with the hazardous waste problem. And if we have to cut back because we are cut back on resources, we're going to cut back in other program areas. We will certainly not let hazardous waste facilities go unregulated. And the fact of the matter is that based on the problems that we're having in Washington, the governor's recommended budget calls for a 15% increase in our budget for next year. And we're going to get 15 new positions to deal with the hazardous waste issue.
Dr. Cortese, your reputation has preceded you. You're generally conceded to be, I think, the top environmental scientist in the state. But let me ask you, what if down the road Dr. Cortese is no longer in the picture and we have somebody who may not be quite as competent involved? Can we be sure, again, that these regulations that you are asking the community to trust and let the company build the site and then down the road we'll be certain it will be taken care of appropriately?
Yes, and let me tell you why. Because it's not just the state that controls it. The community, if they are smart, and we will insist if any siting agreement comes through to the council, should negotiate for compensation to be able to hire their own independent consultant to be able to monitor the facility so that you don't have to trust the state, first of all. Secondly,
I think at this point we're about out of time in this segment, but thank you very much. We'll turn now to Ms. Marshall for a few brief questions.
Dr. Cortese, let me take you back to what Mr. Nelson and his witness keeps referring to as the approval by the Site Safety Council. And I think it's very important that our audience understand exactly what's at issue here. And let's be specific about the Haverhill proposal. What has happened before the Site Safety Council so far with respect to the Haverhill proposal?
What has happened? It has been designated as feasible and deserving to get into the process.
And what does that mean?
What that means is that it's allowed to be looked at and considered further. It allows the community to receive a technical assistance grant to actually be able to review the proposal and make sure that it is environmentally sound and safe. It allows the community to have money to begin negotiations with the developer. But it does not mean any kind of preliminary approval.
And what is a technical assistance grant?
This is one of the provisions that I insisted as part of the Legislative Commission on Hazardous Waste be in the law, to provide and technical money to the community so that they can hire their own independent experts to be able to evaluate the proposal and make sure that it will be absolutely safe before they allow it to be built. We should not have facilities built in this.
I'm afraid we'll have to interrupt, but thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you, Ms. Marshall, and thank you, Dr. Cortese, for joining us tonight on The Advocates. Thank you. For those of you who may have just joined us, our question tonight is, should cities and towns in Massachusetts have the right to refuse hazardous waste treatment facilities? Avi Nelson says yes. Advocate Margaret Marshall says no. Mr. Nelson has presented one witness for tonight's question, and Ms. Marshall one witness against. Ms. Marshall will now continue our debate with her next witness. Ms. Marshall?
I call as my next witness Mr. John Mclennan.
Mr. Mclennan, welcome to the Advocates.
Mr. Mclennan is former regional administrator of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency in New England, and is now a consultant in the field of hazardous waste management. John, let me go back to the question before the floor this evening. The question is a very simple one. Should cities and towns in this Commonwealth have the right to veto the building of a hazardous waste treatment facility? What's your answer to that?
I think if they have the right to veto facilities in their town, we'll never have adequate facilities in the state to deal or treat the waste that is being generated in the state.
And why do you say that?
Because we have had a history of communities attempting to pass laws and zoning regulations to stop those facilities from coming in. It happened in my town. A zoning bylaw was introduced, but in fact, the town meeting voted to turn it back and to leave the town able to be considered for a hazardous waste facility.
But you know, when Mr. Nelson, for example, talks about home rule, and he sort of brought it up as a last point, it's really not a last point. It's quite fundamental to our tradition in New England. Are you suggesting that home rule simply be ignored and the long democratic process be pushed to the side?
Not at all. I'm a home rule advocate, but I think that in this situation we have, in my opinion, the most critical environmental problem facing our state today. And it's a problem that faces the entire state, all the communities in the state, all the people in this state. And we need to have a community or statewide solution to it, not unlike other kinds of facilities that serve the greater public interest. A classic example is a highway, a state highway, the Mass Turnpike extension, for instance. When that extension was put through, the communities along the line opposed it. The state couldn't stand that. We weren't ever going to get a turnpike extension to the turnpike into Boston in order for all our citizens to use it without the legislature approving the override.
But what about these treatment facilities now? Assuming that there is an overriding need, and assuming it is a community-wide need and there shouldn't be a local veto, aren't there some legitimate concerns about safety here?
In my opinion, a facility of this nature can be built and operated to totally minimize a potential hazard to the environment and to public health. The problem is, the real problem in Massachusetts is the mismanagement of hazardous waste, and as long as we don't have these facilities, as has been already stated, hazardous waste is being disposed of improperly in large amounts.
Let's go back to the Haverhill, and I'm sure our audience will understand that there's now a major dispute in Haverhill, and it's one of the towns where the process has come the furthest. Take the corporation that's made the proposal in Haverhill. What corporation is that?
SRS Corporation.
And are you familiar with the corporation?
Yes.
And is that the corporation that Mr. Nelson alluded to, that had an explosion in New Jersey?
Yes, although the illusion was made, I think, that the entire facility blew up. That is not the case. There was a fire, and about 30% of the facility was disabled as a result of it. But as a matter of fact, the systems in place to protect from a general conflagration worked. The fire was contained, the fire department came, and the fire was put out in exactly the proper sequence that it should have.
But if I'm sitting in the town of Haverhill, what reasonable assurance do I have that some out-of-state corporation that has no particular commitment to Massachusetts will come in and will construct a facility which is safe? What assurance do I have?
I think that the difference is that we're talking about the construction of the state-of-the-art facility. here in Haverhill or here in Massachusetts.
What do you mean by state-of-the-art?
State-of-the-art. This is the utilization of the absolute most modern technology. There have been no new facilities licensed in the United States in the last 5 years. And during that period, technology has advanced, particularly in facilities in Europe. It's time that that facility was utilized here. And I think that the state regulatory processes that are in place and the fact that one negotiates a siting agreement with the local community will guarantee or can guarantee that the state-of-the-art technology will be used in Massachusetts or the facility will not be approved.
Now, do you agree with Mr. Nelson that what's happening here is that the private developer just determines where the site is and rams it down a local community's throat?
It does not ram it down the local community. In fact, by the fact that the local developer chooses the site, and it may do either. It may choose the site or it may go into the site suggestion process. But if it chooses the site, the burden of proof is on the developer to show that that site is environmentally sound and will not contribute to a public safety hazard.
And what are some of the proposals that SRC has made in SRS has made in Haverhill?
Well, one of the things.
15 seconds for your answer.
One of the things we'll do, that site has been criticized because it's on the Merrimack River. That site will be built to protect it against inundation or accident in the event of a 500-year flood, not just a 100-year.
And can that be done?
Yes, it can be done and will be done.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Now we'll go to Mr. Nelson, who has some questions for Mr. Mclennan.
Mr. Mclennan, let me understand this about the state-of-the-art facility. As I understand it, what you're saying is a few years ago they didn't build them too good. One of them blew up. I'm sorry, only 30% of it blew up in New Jersey.
That facility was built 20 years ago, not 2 years ago.
And at the time it was considered state-of-the-art.
And I might also add that Wally said that it would be, the facility built in Haverhill would be like the one that blew up in Linden. It will not be like the one that built.
Well, we don't know what it'll be like yet. I mean, we as the general public don't know yet.
We have submitted preliminary engineering design on that facility that shows that it's clearly different.
You keep assuring us of all the negotiation and regulations yet to come, so we don't know what we're going to end up with.
It's a public document. It's in the
I'm sure it is, but
it
may go through some metamorphoses. The point I'm driving at is that I wonder if we can be assured now that the companies can build it safe. I mean, how far down the road do we have to go before we're sure that the companies aren't just going to school at our expense? And, gee, if the one doesn't work in Haverhill, there may be one in Podunk, Iowa, but we're sure this time because we fixed what was wrong in Haverhill. How can you be so certain that the state-of-the-art has gotten to a state of acceptance with the community?
Because this technology is accepted, known technology utilized by industry. What we're talking about is the licensing of off-site facilities. There are on-site facilities here in Massachusetts and in other states that treat and process solvents, that do use state-of-the-art technology, one right here in the Commonwealth, and anybody can go and look at it. And that is the kind of facility we propose to build in Haverhill.
Well, Mr. Mclennan, I guess I would have liked to hear that SRS had used state-of-the-art update techniques to prevent whatever happened in New Jersey. Let me move on to the question of negotiation, which, of course, is the phase that we're in now with regard to Haverhill and Warren, and would be the second step once it gets by the Site Safety Council. Now, as I understand it, the regulation says that both sides now enter into the negotiation process. As you know, negotiations cost money, lots of research, attorneys, consultants. Do you really expect that the community will be able to compete with a big company funding a very important facility? Isn't it true that, for example, up to now, the community of Haverhill has been outspent by more than 6-to-1 by SRS?
Well, you say a big company on one hand when it's going into negotiation, but a small company on the other when it suits you to show that it won't be financially solvent to run the facility. In fact, the company has spent probably 6 times as much as the town, but the burden of proof is on the company to show that that site is adequate and show what they're doing. To produce an environmental impact report is no small job. The town is not required to do that, the company is, and that's the way it ought to be. As far as going into negotiations with SRS is concerned, I believe that the state has already provided, or the Site Safety Council, the city of Haverhill with $60,000 in grants to do the environmental analysis on our impact report and to provide them with the resources with which to go into negotiation. So they have the resources available to them.
You asked me to choose between small and large. In the community of Warren, they're proposing a $100 million facility. This is the IT corporation. The total assessed value of the entire town of Warren is about a third as great, $35 million.
The point is that the technical grants are available to these communities to give. Technical assistance grants are available to these communities to give them the resources.
They get $45,000 from the state. Is that a fair process? Do you really think the town can
You
compete?
cannot, it doesn't cost as much to read a book as it does to write a book. And it costs $300,000 to do an impact report.
You're writing
but
in
it
the-
only costs $50,000 to find out whether it's any good or not.
You're writing and the citizens are reading, but they don't like what they're reading. Speaking of reading, let me read you a
It
quote.
depends upon how you look at it.
Let me read you a quote from someone famous.
Is it me?
Is a mistake? I was going to ask you that after I read it. It would be a mistake to locate a facility, quote, at a site where contaminants could travel quickly through the ground to any aquifer that is an important source of drinking water, unquote. That sound familiar?
If I said it, it's correct.
You said it. You said it. I even have...
Fortunately, that isn't the case in Haverhill, and
It's not the case.
We've proved that in our
It's
environmental
100
impact
feet
report.
from the Merrimack River, but nothing's going to get in that 100 feet.
That says through the ground to a drinking water aquifer. And all the tests that we have done on the Haverhill site indicate that there is very little transportation in the ground, and in fact, the transportation goes towards the river and not into an aquifer.
Let me try another quote. Even for a well-designed facility, proper location is critical, unquote. If the site is critical, how can we accept the situation that the company shall choose the site and the town must accept it?
What the alternative, what you're suggesting, is if towns have veto power and helter-skelter, they veto these facilities around the state, where we do find ideal or acceptable above a certain threshold sites, and towns go and veto those sites, we're constantly going to be compromising our way downward.
We're not suggesting that, John. What we're saying is that if you treat the community as responsible people and don't take their authority away from them and make a good case, as has happened, as you know, in other places, in other states, and even perhaps in this state, they will be interested in accepting a hazardous waste facility site, but they also want to
Let me interrupt
be able to
at this point, if we might. Thank you, Mr. Nelson. We'll go back now to Ms. Marshall, who has a few brief questions.
John, let's just pick up on that last point of Mr. Nelson's. If you treat the community responsibly, he suggests, has there been an opportunity for Massachusetts cities and towns to come forward and offer to have a hazardous waste treatment plant located?
Yes, there have been two. The Liquicon proposal was site suggestion, and the IT proposal. I believe only the city of New Bedford came forward with any sites.
And
so
what
we've
happened?
had two complete statewide surveys or potential for communities to come forward to offer sites, and only one community has come forward with any sites.
And what happened to the New Bedford proposed
I think
site?
they came forward with 3 sites, and 2 of them were environmentally unsound, and the third one, I think, was rejected by the company.
So you would agree with Mr. Nelson that location is very important, is that the case?
Absolutely.
Are you some kind of company hack here tonight?
I'm insulted by your question.
Well, I'm trying to suggest what Mr. Nelson seems to be implying, that you're representing the company and you don't have any concern for the environment around the town of Haverhill.
No,
is that the case?
I think I have a pretty good record as an environmentalist.
And on that
I think
note, I'm
the
afraid we'll have to interrupt, but thank you, Mr. Mclennan. We appreciate it.
It's going to be great.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, and thank you, Mr. Mclennan, for joining us tonight on The Advocates. Mr. Nelson.
I call Professor Ken Geiser.
Thank you, Dr. Geiser, for joining us on The Advocates. Professor Geiser graciously agreed to join us tonight when our scheduled witness, environmental attorney Gregor McGregor, withdrew. Mr. McGregor is counsel in a suit against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the issue of hazardous waste facilities. Mr. Nelson.
Thank you. Professor Geiser is professor of environmental policy at Tufts University. Now, Professor, you've heard Mr. Mclennan say that he thinks the process is fair, working well. Do you agree?
No, I don't think the process is fair, but the real issue is, do the citizens of this Commonwealth think it's fair? I've tried to follow this Site Safety Council now for almost a full year, and to follow it for the year and a half of its development. I would suggest that we've probably seen no regulations until 3 weeks ago, but further, we've seen criteria change, I think something like 8 or 10 times during the decision-making process in regards to these sites. Not only that, Commissioner Cortese does admit that his own division doesn't have regulations to protect these hazardous waste facilities at this time, and they probably won't be in effect until late fall.
Now, through it all, through these 8 to 10 changes, somehow they managed to approve every proposal that came before them, though.
Basically, they've rubber-stamped these proposals. They've had to. There's just been, first of all, the very timing. They've had 15 days. That's the allotted amount of time that the Site Safety Council has to review the notice of intent. and basically that's not long enough. There are further time periods down the line of 30 and 60 days, which are nowhere near long enough to make these crucial kinds of decisions. This whole siting process is built on a very rapid, very fast kind of pace for making these kinds of decisions.
So
Further, and that is that the personnel for the Site Safety Council, which is presumably the monitor for all these, is very limited. The staff includes no biologist, no geologist, no hydrologist. There are very few people there who have the capacity to really make these decisions.
So you're basically concerned about the adequacy of the resources and the time that the administrative arms would have. Let me shift to a different question. The other side has made a point about that we need these plants. Otherwise, we're going to drown in our own waste, if I may paraphrase. Do you agree? Is there this crisis of need?
There's a very strange thing about this need issue. I mean, we've been told over and over again there's this major, major need out there. And the one thing we always ride on is there's this vast amount of illegal dumping out there. No one's documented this vast amount of illegal dumping. We don't have decent studies on it. The one thing we do have is criminals. We have people who have been caught, and that's due to the fine work of Commissioner Cortese's division. But that has only produced a very small number of people who've actually been doing this. Yet we're going ahead on the basis that there is major amounts of illegal dumping out there.
Matter of fact, there was an article in the Springfield Morning Union just earlier this month that said that the state in a report had made a mistake and overestimated the amount of hazardous waste by some 80%. That's a pretty good overstatement, isn't it?
There are serious problems with all the data that's being used at this point.
Let me differentiate between short-term and long-term. I mean, a crisis, I think, has an aura of immediacy about it. Isn't it true that Mr. Mclennan, in a report that he prepared for the state, pointed out that at present there are adequate service companies and the existence of capacity shortfall within the state, therefore does not at present prevent proper and legal hazardous waste management?
There's two ways to cut the need question. The first is there really a vacuum out there? Is there a real vacuum for it? And the second is, what's the capacity like? Mr. Mclennan himself in reports have documented the existence of a network of hazardous waste treatment facilities in the Commonwealth and throughout New England. 9, I believe, in the Commonwealth itself that are functioning at this point, in place. We also know, in talking to people in those treatment facilities and larger facilities in Connecticut and New Jersey, that most of those facilities are operating under capacity, that they don't have enough waste to justify their current expenses.
As a matter of fact, aren't the original authors of this proposal themselves backing away from it now and thinking of a moratorium?
Now that's a piece of irony. I mean, Senator Robert Wetmore, who was the father of this bill, a significantly sensitive senator, has now taken a position of asking for a 5-year moratorium on this process. That's backing away.
Doesn't sound like a crisis then.
Further, Carol Amick, another senator with a fine reputation on environmental issues, has offered legislation that, I believe, documents some 21 amendments to this process.
Let me change. I've got to introduce one more important subject, and that's the question of home rule, which far from I'm putting last, I'm trying to give emphasis. Given all these situations and the concern about whether the state can be trusted, would you say that the state should have final authority, or should it be up to the local townspeople?
We'll have to ask you to answer that in about 10 seconds.
Well, the answer is no. Basically, towns should have the authority to veto these kinds of facilities. Is that quick enough?
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Ms. Marshall, your witness.
Professor Geiser, you don't live in one of the towns that has a contaminated water supply, do you?
No.
No, of course you don't. You're not one of the 31 towns. That's not a crisis.
I live in a town that has had a serious environmental crisis.
But it doesn't have one of the
around
contaminated
toxic waste.
ones. And you're certainly not anywhere near when one of the 97 hazardous waste sites was discovered and put out of existence by Commissioner Cortese, were you?
I spend a lot of time working with community groups that do.
I'm not suggesting you don't work with community groups. I'm just saying that what your definition of a crisis is might not be the person who's living in that town. The fact of the matter is that you don't particularly know how much illegal waste there is either, do you?
No.
But you do know, because I think it's been well established, that of the hazardous waste that we know, only 10% is treated in Massachusetts. That's correct.
I don't know if that's true.
Well, I think that there have been at least 2 recent studies that have confirmed that.
The studies that I have seen suggest anywhere from 25 to 30% of it is treated in Massachusetts in existing facilities, and the rest a vast
Well, I
amount is
don't want
in
to
New
get
England.
into a debate on statistics, but there's nowhere near the majority is being treated in Massachusetts. Some of it is being shipped out of state, isn't it?
Some is being shipped out of state.
And do you know how much of hazardous waste is produced by companies that have fewer than 50 employees in Massachusetts?
A lot of it is produced by small firms.
And aren't those the ones that are not going to be able to have their own treatment facilities on site?
It's interesting that you mention that because the facility, for instance, that's being currently planned at Warren is of such a scale, being the largest facility planned in North America, it's never going to handle little problems of 50-person firms. That kind of thing is dealt with at a much more decentralized, much more local level.
Any manufacturer in Massachusetts of hazardous waste can ship its hazardous waste to Wallen or to Haverhill or any place closer. If the facilities are there, it's available. If they're not there, they have nowhere to ship it. Is that the case? Are you arguing tonight that you don't want any treatment facilities in Massachusetts?
No, I'm arguing that we do not need a large-scale centralized facility, and I am also arguing that the siting process is creating a major break in trust for the citizens of this Commonwealth.
Well, let's just take a look at how the siting process is occurring. You seem to be suggesting that there are no regulations, or that the regulations keep changing. But there are, in fact, EPA clean air regulations. Is that correct?
There are.
And the EPA water regulations. Is that correct?
There are state regulations as well, and they are handled well.
And there's Chapter 151B, and there's Chapter 21C, and there's Chapter 21B. In fact, there are a lot of regulations. You just want a whole lot more regulations. Is that correct?
No, I'm not asking for any more than the state is currently asking for.
So the regulations are, in fact, sufficient, but you still
If
want
they
a
were
more...
in place.
There's going to be no licensed facility, and Commissioner Cortese is on record of saying no facility will be licensed until those regulations are in place. Is that correct?
I think he is, and I think at that point we should be considering centralized hazardous waste facilities, but not until those regulations are in place.
But in fact, it takes 3 to 5 years for the process to go through from beginning to end. Is that correct? I mean, so far in Haverhill, we're into the 2nd or 3rd year, and in fact, they haven't even got to the position where the local public health has okayed the proposal.
We need to see those regulations in place, though.
But so you want to wait, you don't want to get going, you don't want to even commence the process. You just want a moratorium until everything's in place. Meanwhile, more and more hazardous waste is being produced, and it's just being dumped somewhere. You don't know where, and you don't know how much.
We don't know where it is being dumped, but we assume that a lot of it is being recycled on site. There is increasing amounts of source reduction, a lot because of the enforcement policies of Commissioner Cortese.
But not everything. It's just some amount of hazardous waste
Nor do we
out
know
there,
the
and we don't-
potential for how much could be recycled and treated on site.
But you've just listened to all the enforcement statistics that Commissioner Cortese gave of how many people have been found violating the existing regulations, and that's only in 1981.
It sounded like a small number for such a vast problem.
That's right, because the problem is vast, and in fact he's not in a position to enforce all of it. And one of the reasons why the illegal dumping continues is because there are no facilities here, and he can't be held responsible for enforcing the thousands and thousands of Massachusetts industries that manufacture hazardous waste that have no place to ship it except great expense out of state. Do you know that it costs Massachusetts produces 4 times as much for interstate transportation as comparable national averages? Or is that another statistic that you just don't pay any attention to?
My understanding is the transport costs relative to the treatment costs is rather minor. The transport is a loading and unloading process as well as the actual mileage distances.
But you don't dispute that if you remove the transport costs, perhaps those small industries that can't afford long transport costs and treatment costs would have the facility closer at home. Is that correct?
We do need to work with those small facilities to find out what it is that they will need in order to
Let me
reduce
just ask you
their
one
amount of
final
waste.
thing. Do you think the state should do a survey and select the best site and then say that's the place we're going to put it? Is that what you're advocating?
No, I'm not. I'm advocating rather that we should look at a whole series of smaller scale improvements in the hazardous waste management system. And that includes building on the existing facilities, increasing the regulations, increasing the
exactly what's
enforcement.
being
Okay,
done.
forgive me
That's
for interrupting
exactly
here.
what's
Thank you,
being
Ms. Marshall. And now we'll go back to Mr. Nelson for a few final questions.
Professor, isn't it true that transportation amounts to about 10% of the cost of processing the waste? So that
Again, it's always risky, but that's my understanding.
let me go back to this point now about the illegal dumping of hazardous waste. It is true that it is against the law, right?
It is.
So it's an enforcement problem, not a matter of doing a whole bunch of other things. If we could get tougher, then we might be better off in this area.
Yes.
And if we don't get tougher with enforcement, then we can make the hazardous waste facilities as available as you want. It will still cost more to process the waste legally than to just throw them in a field.
Yes.
Now, let me get back to this question of the community's acceptance. Isn't it true that in Massachusetts and in other states there are communities that are willing to accept plans if they trust what is being told to them and they trust the security of the facilities?
Just about 10 seconds for your answer, Professor.
Yes, there is an Institute of Toxic Waste Management report that suggests that communities, that siting can take place where the community people trust their government, where they are involved from the beginning in the siting questions, and where the sites are environmentally sound.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Nelson, and thank you, Dr. Geiser, for joining us in the Advocates. We appreciate it. And now it's time for the closing arguments. Ms. Marshall?
If we allow towns to say no to hazardous waste facilities, there will be no hazardous waste facilities in Massachusetts. And all of us know that, and we know it instinctively. The issue here isn't that there aren't enough regulations, or if the regulations aren't stringent enough, or that it's an out-of-state facility, or that it's an out-of-state corporation, or it's only 10% of the transportation cost. The issue is a simple one. None of us want it in our backyards, but we all generate hazardous waste. And we can no longer put our head in the sand and hope that the problem will go away, or better still, hope that the town next door will take care of it. There's state-of-the-art technology that, together with the stringent regulations that everybody tonight has conceded Dr. Cortese is enforcing, will ensure that we can have safe treatment facilities built in the communities in which we live and work. We can no longer proceed on the haphazardous course that Massachusetts has and continue the illegal dumping, which is ultimately going to cause a major health hazard in our Commonwealth.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Mr. Nelson.
We have shown tonight that the current siting law is inadequate. Is there a need? Yes, there's a need, perhaps in the longer term. Is there a crisis? No, there isn't a crisis. And I don't think we should allow ourselves to be stampeded into putting together an inadequate and ill-prepared kind of regulatory system which derives from taking trust away from the government and requiring the townspeople to trust the state and the companies. Neither has a particularly good track record. In other states, and even communities in Massachusetts, have shown willingness to accept these kinds of site facilities. And we can do that. We can approach it that way. We should not trample upon the rights of individuals. We should not ask them to surrender their rights. We should not ask them to leave control of their own security and their own concerns. They have a right to have the decision made about whether or not to accept a hazardous waste facility and whether they should be able to refuse it.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our question tonight has been, should Massachusetts cities and towns have the right to refuse a hazardous waste treatment facility? You've heard the arguments on both sides of this complex question. It's now time for you, our audience at home, to participate. Write and tell us which side of the question you support. Just send a postcard with your vote to the Advocates, Hazardous Waste, WGBH-TV, Boston, 02134. And now, with thanks to our advocates and the distinguished witnesses and to our host, the Kennedy School of Government, we conclude tonight's debate.
For a transcript of tonight's broadcast, please send $4 to Advocates, Box 1000, Boston, Massachusetts, 02118. Please allow 6 to 8 weeks for delivery.